This helmet belonged to my father. It sat on the top shelf of our hall closet for 31 years. My mother never moved it. She never explained it, and whenever I asked, and I did ask, every few years, long into my 20s, she would look at the crack along the left side, the dark stain cured into the liner, and she would say the same 3 words. "Leave it, Thomas." So I left it. I left it because by the time I was old enough to understand the shape of the story, I already knew the version that mattered to our town. December 1944. The Ardennes, a young private from rural Pennsylvania who walked away from his position during the worst week of the siege at Bastogne. Men died because of the gap he left. His commanding officer put it in writing. I grew up in the shadow of that document. My father came home in the summer of 1945. He worked the farm. He never joined the VFW. He never marched in the parade. He went to Mass on Sundays, and he sat in the back pew, and he left before the hymn. He died of a coronary in February of 1976, still carrying whatever he carried, and he took it with him without a word. It was the summer of 1977. I was 34 years old, a father myself by then, when a man named Gerald Mott drove 4 hours from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and knocked on my door. He was thin and white-haired, and he held his hat in both hands the way men of that generation always did when they were nervous. He looked at the closet at the end of the hall as if he already knew what was inside it. "You're Raymond's boy," he said. "I am." "I was with him," he said, "at Bastogne. I was the battalion runner. I was there that night." He paused. "I have been carrying this a long time." In December of 1944, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded. Bastogne, Belgium, a crossroads town that both armies understood to be the hinge of the entire Ardennes offensive, was encircled by 8 German divisions. The temperature dropped to 6 degrees. The men had no winter gear, limited ammunition, and almost no medical supplies. The fog that blanketed the forest for the first week grounded every resupply flight. Roughly 12,000 American soldiers held that perimeter. Among them was Private First Class Raymond Callahan, 23 years old, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, assigned to a rifle platoon under the command of First Lieutenant Arthur Greer. This account is drawn from the testimony of PFC Gerald Mott, battalion runner, who filed a formal statement with the Army in 1954 that was never acted upon, and from the journal he kept in his coat pocket through the entire siege, which he carried to my door that summer morning in a wax paper envelope. He set the envelope on my kitchen table, and he said, "Read it later. Let me tell you first." Raymond Callahan was not a man who drew attention to himself. His sergeant, a Rhode Island man named Patrice Duval, said later, in a letter to Gerald Mott that Mott read aloud to me in my kitchen, that Raymond was the kind of soldier you didn't notice until you needed him. He didn't grouse. He didn't boast. He kept his rifle clean and his foxhole tight, and he shared his rations without being asked. Duval wrote, "Callahan was the one man I knew for certain would still be there in the morning. He was from a farm outside Elizabethtown. Before the war, he had worked his father's 60 acres, fixed what broke, and driven his mother to church every Sunday without fail. He was engaged to a woman named Elsa when the induction notice arrived. He married her the week before he shipped out. He did not write home about the fighting. His letters, which Elsa kept, and which she showed me only once, and only for a few minutes, and which she held against her chest the whole time, were about the farm. He asked about the corn. He asked about the leak in the barn roof. He asked whether the dog was still sleeping at the foot of the bed. In the first days of the siege, his platoon was assigned to hold a stretch of tree line on the southeast approach to town. The ground was frozen so hard the men couldn't dig. They piled whatever they could find, fallen timber, ammunition crates, a section of collapsed wall, and called it a position. The German artillery found them on the morning of December 21st. What happened in the following 48 hours is the part that was written up, the part my father carried, the part that followed his name. But the report that was written was not the one Gerald Mott had seen. Lieutenant Arthur Greer was the kind of officer who arrived in a unit already convinced of his own authority. He was 26, West Point trained, and he had never seen sustained contact before the Ardennes. The men of the platoon had learned, in the weeks before the encirclement, to work around him quietly, to solve the problems he created before he noticed them, and to answer his decisions with, "Yes, sir," and then do what actually needed doing. On the night of December 20th, Greer received an order he didn't like. Hold the current line, no withdrawal, regardless of pressure on the flanks. He didn't like it because the flanks were already crumbling. An aid station, a converted stone shed 50 yards behind their position, held 11 wounded men from 2 separate squads. A staff sergeant named Borowski and a medic named Corporal Finch were the only men with them. If the German line pushed through the tree line in the night, those 11 men had nowhere to go. Greer's orders said, "Hold the line." They did not address the aid station. Private Callahan raised it at the evening briefing. "Sir, if they come through the left side before dawn—" "They won't," Greer said. "But if they do, Borowski can't move 11 litters in the dark, not in this cold. Your job is the tree line, Callahan. You want to be a medic? Transfer to the medics." The other men in the briefing looked at the ground. Gerald Mott wrote in his journal that night. Callahan spoke right. Nobody else said a word. Greer acts like the cold is something he ordered. The German probe came at 03:30. It came from the left, exactly as Raymond had said it might. The platoon held barely. 3 men were wounded in the first exchange. The line contracted, and in the confusion of that first terrible hour, a gap opened on the left flank, directly in the approach to the aid station. Mott was running messages between positions when he heard it. A single rifle, steady and deliberate, from the direction of the gap. Not a firefight. One rifle, firing in measured cadence, drawing the German patrol's attention away from the shed. He didn't know whose rifle it was until he found Raymond's empty foxhole at dawn. "I thought he'd been taken," Mott told me. "I ran to Greer. I said Callahan's position was empty, and Greer—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. Greer looked at me and said, "He ran. Write it down." Mott looked at me across my kitchen table. "I said, sir, I heard a rifle from the gap all night," and Greer said, "That was Borowski. But Borowski had a shattered collarbone. Borowski couldn't lift a rifle." Raymond Callahan was listed as having abandoned his post under fire. The report was signed by Lieutenant Arthur Greer. It was filed before the fog lifted, before the relief column arrived, before anyone looked at the gap in the tree line where the brass casings were. The aid station held. All 11 men were evacuated when the road opened on December 26th. Raymond's name was in the report. before anyone counted the casings. He came home with an honorable discharge. The investigation had concluded nothing provable, and the Army, exhausted and overwhelmed in the spring of 1945, had closed the matter without a finding. But in the world that mattered, in the county, in the town, in the VFW hall where his own neighbors gathered on Friday nights, the report existed. Someone had seen it, or heard of it, or half heard of it, and that half was enough. His own brother didn't speak to him for 4 years. His father, my grandfather, a man who had lost 2 fingers to a thresher and never once complained, told him once at Sunday dinner, with the whole family at the table, "I don't know what happened over there, Raymond, but whatever it was, you should have said something." Raymond passed the bread and said nothing. I asked my mother once in the last year of her life whether he had ever told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "He told me the first night he was home. He said the men in the shed were alive. He said that was enough." She turned away from me. "It wasn't enough for us," she said. "It wasn't enough for me, and I have been ashamed of that ever since." Gerald Mott did not come to my house in 1977 to offer comfort. He came because he had filed a statement with the Army in 1954 and been told the matter was closed. He came because Arthur Greer had died that spring, and with Greer dead, Mott was the last man who had been in that tree line and knew. He came because he was 61 years old, and he had carried a wax paper envelope in a desk drawer for 23 years, and he was not willing to carry it to his own grave. He spread the journal on my table. His handwriting from 1944 was cramped and pencil faint. I had to angle it toward the window light. He walked me through the entries one by one. December 21st, 0400, rifle still going from the gap, nobody asking about it. December 22nd, Greer's report filed. I asked to amend. He said no. He said Callahan ran. December 23rd, counted the casings in the gap. 41. A man stood there all night. December 24th, Borowski's arm is in a sling from the collarbone. He can't hold a spoon. At the bottom of the December 24th entry, in letters slightly larger than the rest, the rifle in the gap was Callahan's. The men in the shed are alive because of it. I know this. I do not know what to do with it. I sat there for a while. The morning light was coming through the window above the sink. My wife had taken the kids to her mother's for the day. "Why didn't you?" I started. "I tried," he said. "In 46, in 48, in 54. The Army said the record was closed. Greer was still an active officer in 54. He had friends. He folded his hands on the table. "I am sorry, Thomas. I am sorry I didn't find you sooner. I am sorry it wasn't enough while your father was alive." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set something else on the table. It was the cracked helmet. My mother's cracked helmet, from the top shelf of the hall closet. "Your mother sent it to me in 1962, he said quietly. "She wrote me a letter. She'd found my address through the Division Association. She sent the helmet and she wrote, 'I think you knew what this meant. I want someone to know.'" He looked at me. "I've had it for 15 years. I brought it back today because it belongs with you." I didn't know what I expected him to say next. Part of me, sitting there, had convinced myself that Mott had come to ask for something, some formal step I could take, some petition I could file, some process that would require my energy and my faith in institutions that had already failed my father once. I had steeled myself for that. I had already decided sitting there that I would do it, whatever it was, and that it would probably go nowhere, and that I would do it anyway. Gerald Mott reached into his jacket one more time. He set a single folded document on the table. He smoothed it with his palm. It was a letter on Army letterhead, dated 6 weeks earlier. It was signed by a brigadier general named Paul Selkirk of the Judge Advocate General's Corps. It said, in language I had to read 3 times to believe, that following a review of the after-action records of the 506th PIR, December 1944, and in light of physical evidence and sworn testimony provided by Gerald F. Mott, formerly of the same unit, the service record of Private First Class Raymond J. Callahan was to be amended. The notation of abandonment was to be struck. In its place, a commendation was to be entered. Conspicuous gallantry under fire, Bastogne, Belgium, December 21st, 1944. A Bronze Star, awarded posthumously, was enclosed in a small cardboard box that Mott had kept in his coat pocket. He didn't hand it to me. He set it on the table and he pushed it slowly across, the way a man slides something precious across a surface when he is afraid of dropping it. It took me 23 years, he said. It should have taken 23 days. I am sorry, son. I couldn't speak for a moment. When I could, I said, he never told me. No, said Mott. He wouldn't. That was Raymond. I picked up the box. It was lighter than I expected. Everything about that moment was lighter and heavier than I expected, all at once. He died believing I believed the report, I said. Mott was quiet. Then, he died knowing 11 men went home. He was built to find that sufficient. He stood and put his hat back on. He was at the door when I called after him. Did you see him after the war? He turned. Something crossed his face that I cannot fully describe. Grief and pride, and the particular sadness of men who survived things they are not entirely sure they deserved to survive. Once, he said, 1951, I drove through Elizabethtown. I didn't stop. I saw him in a field fixing a fence line. He had his back to the road. He paused. He looked like a man at peace. I told myself he was. I needed to believe that. He left. I stood in my kitchen with the helmet and the box and the journal and the light through the window, and 31 years of a story I had gotten completely wrong. Colonel Walter Beecham, retired, and for many years a professor of military history at the University of Pittsburgh, wrote in his study of the Ardennes campaign, "The error of Bastogne is not tactical. The error is human. An officer in fear of his own record will always find a subordinate to carry it. The tragedy is not that this happens. The tragedy is that the subordinate, 9 times in 10, allows it, not from weakness, but from a particular kind of strength we do not have a word for, a willingness to be misread, a decision to let the work be its own testimony." My father made that decision on the night of December 21st, 1944, in a frozen gap in the Belgian forest, with 41 rounds of ammunition and 11 men behind him in a shed. He never filed a rebuttal. He never asked Gerald Mott to speak. He came home, and he worked the farm, and he sat in the back pew, and he left before the hymn. I think I understand now why he left before the hymn, not because he felt unworthy of it, because he had already said everything he intended to say. The work was done. The men were alive. The rest, the report, the town, the brothers' silence, the long Sundays at the back of the church, was simply the price of having chosen correctly, and he had decided to pay it without complaint. That is not what I would have done. I am not sure it is what most men would have done. But Raymond Callahan was not most men, and I spent 34 years not knowing it. The helmet is on my desk now, not on a shelf, not in a closet, on my desk where I can see it. The crack runs along the left side from the rim to the crown. The liner is dark. I used to think it was the mark of a man who ran. I know now it is the mark of a man who stayed. General Selkirk's letter is framed beside it. The Bronze Star is in a case next to that. I never knew my father the way you know a man who tells you who he is. He didn't tell anyone. He let the Gap speak for him, and the Gap was in a Belgian forest. And for 31 years, nobody came to read it. Gerald Mott read it. He drove 4 hours, and he knocked on my door, and he set the truth on my kitchen table piece by piece, and I received it piece by piece, the way you receive something that reorders every year you have already lived. My father died before they cleared his name. But the helmet is on my desk, and the 11 men went home, and I know, and now, so do you. If your father carried something he never explained, if you grew up in the shadow of a story you only had half of, leave his name in the comments. He deserves to be said out loud. Subscribe if you believe that some debts take decades to arrive, but they arrive